It is a little after midnight on February 28, 1942, and the Channel wind is cutting across the cliffs above a small French fishing hamlet called Bruneval. Above the sound of the surf, a low drone builds in the darkness. 12 Whitley bombers, engines throttled back, are crossing the coast at just under 600 feet, low enough that the men crouched in their bellies can make out the pale line of chalk cliffs below. Inside the aircraft, young paratroopers of C Company, 2nd Parachute Battalion, sit in full battle order, parachutes clipped, weapons slung, faces blacked with cork and cocoa. Somewhere below them, unseen in the moonlit dark, sits a piece of German engineering that the finest scientific minds in Britain have never actually touched. It looks, from the reconnaissance photographs pinned to the walls of a requisitioned house in London, like a great gray dish, 10 feet across, mounted on a turntable beside a cliff-top villa. Nobody in Britain knows exactly what it is made of, how it is wired, or precisely how it works. What they do know is that this machine, or one very like it, has been guiding German night fighters onto the tails of British bombers with an accuracy that no jamming, no evasive maneuver, and no amount of raw courage has yet been able to defeat. Tonight, 120 men are about to jump into occupied France to steal it. Not to destroy it, not to photograph it from a distance, to physically tear the heart out of it, carry the pieces down a cliff path under fire, and get them onto a boat bound for England before the sun comes up. What happens in the next few hours will decide whether Britain can see in the dark as clearly as its enemy can, and it will do so at a moment when very little else in the war is going Britain's way. By the closing weeks of 1941, the strategic picture facing Britain was bleak in almost every direction one cared to look. German forces controlled the length of continental Europe from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. U-boats prowled the North Atlantic in growing numbers, threatening to strangle the supply lines that kept the country fed and armed. Only 2 forms of offensive action remained genuinely open to Britain: raiding operations against the occupied coastline and the nightly bombing campaign flown by RAF Bomber Command against targets in Germany and occupied Europe. Of the two, the bomber offensive mattered enormously, both militarily and as a signal to a battered public that Britain could still strike back. Yet, through 1941, that offensive was being quietly and systematically bled white. Losses to German night fighters rose sharply, and crews returning from raids spoke of interceptions that felt less like chance encounters and more like ambushes, aircraft picked out of the darkness with an accuracy that owed nothing to luck. Scientific intelligence officers, chief among them a young physicist named Reginald Victor Jones, working for the Air Ministry and MI6, began piecing together fragments of evidence, captured documents, decrypted signals traffic, interrogations of prisoners, and the wreckage of downed German aircraft. The picture that emerged was unwelcome. Germany was believed to be operating not one but 2 distinct radar systems along its coastline, a longer-ranged early warning system codenamed Freya, and a second, shorter-ranged but far more precise system that appeared in decrypted German communications under the codename Würzburg. If Jones and his colleagues were right, the Würzburg set was capable of tracking a single bomber with enough precision to steer a night fighter directly onto it, a capability British radar of the period simply could not match for accuracy at that range. The trouble was that nobody in Britain had ever seen one up close. Every theory about how the Würzburg worked, how it might be jammed, spoofed, or defeated, rested on guesswork built from shadows and static. Britain could not counter a weapon it did not understand, and Bomber Command could not be expected to keep flying into a threat that remained, quite literally, invisible to those trying to fight it. Existing countermeasures developed against the older Freya system and against German night fighter control more broadly were proving stubbornly ineffective against whatever this new device actually was. The only way to close the gap, Jones argued, was to get hold of a Würzburg set, or enough of one, and bring it home for proper examination. That meant finding one within reach and finding a way to take it. The breakthrough came from the air, not from any laboratory. A photographic reconnaissance Spitfire flying a routine sweep along the Channel coast near Le Havre brought back images of a cliff-top site close to the village of Bruneval, roughly 12 miles north of the port. Among the outbuildings of an isolated villa, analysts spotted the unmistakable circular dish of a Würzburg radar, sitting almost casually in the open, closer to the cliff edge and further from heavy defensive works than any other such installation yet identified. Other German radar sites had been found further inland, some as distant as the Balkans, well beyond the reach of any raiding force. Bruneval was different. It was close to the sea, close enough to a beach for a landing craft to approach, and it appeared to rely more on distance and remoteness for its protection than on layered defenses. Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, recently appointed to head Combined Operations, was given the task of turning that intelligence into a plan. His staff quickly concluded that a raid launched directly from the sea was too dangerous. The Germans had built extensive coastal fortifications along that stretch of cliff specifically to guard against seaborne landings, and a force attempting to fight its way up from the beach would likely take heavy casualties long before it reached the radar, giving the defenders ample time to destroy the very equipment the raiders had come for. Speed and surprise, Mountbatten decided, mattered more than firepower. The solution was to drop the raiding force from the air directly onto the position and withdraw by sea only once the equipment had been seized. It was an unconventional use of Britain's still new airborne forces, and it placed extraordinary faith in men who had never before been tested in a live operation of this kind. The task fell to C Company of the newly formed 2nd Parachute Battalion, commanded by a 30-year-old major named John Frost. Frost's company, drawn largely from Scottish infantry regiments, would be reinforced by a small detachment of Royal Engineers trained to dismantle the radar itself, and by one man whose presence in a combat drop zone was, on paper, faintly absurd, an RAF radar mechanic named Flight Sergeant Charles Cox, a ham radio enthusiast with no parachute training and, by his own account, no memory of ever volunteering for anything of the sort. The plan, that emerged from weeks of secret preparation at a country house in Hampshire, was a small masterpiece of combined operations planning, drawing together Army, Navy, and Air Force in a single coordinated action. Frost's force, around 120 men in total, was divided into several sections, each with a code name and a precise task. One section, under Lieutenant Peter Young, was to seize the villa and the radar installation directly, holding off the small German garrison stationed nearby long enough for the technical team to do its work. A second section, led by Lieutenant John Timothy, would form a defensive screen against German reinforcements known to be garrisoned inland at a farm called Le Presbytère. A third section had perhaps the most nerve-wracking job of all, securing the beach at the foot of the cliff and holding it open for the naval evacuation, the only route home for the entire raiding party. French resistance agents, working under conditions of considerable personal risk, had already confirmed a detail that mattered enormously to the plan's survival. The beach was not mined. 12 Whitley bombers of 51 Squadron would carry the raiders across the channel and drop them from around 600 feet, low enough to reduce drift and scattering in the dark. Once on the ground, the technical dismantling of the radar was to fall to Cox and a handful of Royal Engineers, working against the clock in the open, most likely under fire, to strip away the components that British scientists actually needed: the receiver, the transmitter, and above all the mechanism that allowed the dish to track a moving target with such deadly precision. Nobody involved knew exactly how long that would take, because nobody in Britain had ever taken one of these machines apart before. Down on the beach, 6 Royal Navy assault landing craft, escorted by motor gunboats, would be waiting under cover of darkness to carry the entire party back across the channel to Portsmouth. Every stage of the operation depended on the one before it succeeding in near-total darkness, against an enemy whose exact numbers and alertness could only be estimated from aerial photography and resistance reports. If you are finding this interesting, A quick subscribe helps more than you know. The drop, when it finally came on the night of 27th to 28th of February 1942, after several postponements for weather, went largely to plan, though not entirely. Frost's assault sections landed accurately and moved quickly on the villa and the radar position, catching the German garrison off guard in a short, sharp firefight. 2 prisoners were taken, including a German operator who had actually been working the Würzburg set at the moment of the attack, a stroke of fortune that would later prove invaluable during interrogation back in Britain. Cox and his engineers went to work immediately, wrenching and cutting components from the radar under fire, working with a speed and desperation that owed everything to the knowledge that every minute spent on the cliff top increased the chance of German reinforcements arriving in strength. Not everything went smoothly. Part of the section tasked with securing the beach had been dropped roughly a mile and a half from its intended landing zone, leaving the exit route open and unguarded at the critical moment. As Frost's men began fighting their way down towards the shore with the precious radar components loaded onto specially prepared trolleys, they found the beach held up by a German machine gun position that the missing section should have neutralized. For a tense stretch of the night, the entire raiding party was pinned on open ground, the sea and safety only a few hundred meters away and yet unreachable. The delayed section eventually arrived and helped clear the position, and the withdrawal to the waiting landing craft went ahead, the raiders waiting out under fire with the dismantled radar equipment in their arms. Of the roughly 120 men who had jumped that night, 3 were killed, a small number were wounded, and a handful were left behind and captured when the boats departed. It was, by the standards of wartime raiding, a remarkably light cost for what had been achieved. The precise state of alertness and total strength of the German garrison that night remains difficult to establish with certainty from surviving records, and some details of the fighting on the cliff top rely on the recollections of the men who were there rather than on any surviving German account. What made the raid worth the risk was not the fighting itself, but what came home in the hold of those landing craft. Examination of the captured components back in Britain revealed a machine built along strikingly modular lines, designed so that faulty sections could be swapped out and repaired far more easily than equivalent British radar sets of the period, a piece of engineering pragmatism that rather impressed the scientists studying it, whatever their feelings about its purpose. Interrogation of the captured German technician suggested, perhaps surprisingly, that his level of specialist training fell short of what his British counterparts would have received. Most importantly, close study of the Würzburg's tuning mechanism confirmed something Jones and his colleagues had suspected but could not prove. The set could be adjusted across a wide enough range of frequencies that older, narrowly targeted jamming methods would never reliably defeat it. What was needed instead was something almost absurdly simple by comparison, a technique the British had already been quietly developing, but had held back from using for fear of revealing it to the enemy. Strips of metal foil, cut to a length matched to the radar's wavelength and released in clouds from aircraft, would return a radar echo so dense and confusing that a Würzburg operator would be unable to distinguish a genuine bomber from the drifting cloud around it. The code name for this technique was Window, and Bruneval supplied the final piece of technical confirmation that made its use possible. It is worth pausing to set the Bruneval raid against what German forces themselves managed, and failed to manage, in the same period. Germany never mounted an equivalent operation against British radar installations, despite the chain-home system being no great secret, and despite German intelligence being broadly aware of its existence and importance during the Battle of Britain. Where the Würzburg program suffered from production delays and a lack of urgency in its early development, despite enthusiastic backing from senior figures within the German High Command, British combined operations moved with a speed and improvisational confidence that stood in sharp contrast. American forces, for their part, had no directly comparable radar snatching raid in this period of the war, their own airborne capabilities still being built up and tested through 1942. What set Bruneval apart was less the daring of the concept, since commando raids against coastal targets were nothing new by 1942, and more the precision of its execution. a combined air, sea, and land operation built around a single, narrowly defined technical objective, planned and carried out inside a matter of weeks from the first reconnaissance photograph to the return of the landing craft. It became something of a template that other Allied planners, including those later assembling the vastly larger airborne operations of 1944, would study closely. The material haul from Bruneval was by any measure extraordinary, but its deeper legacy lay in what it set in motion rather than in the components themselves. Window was first used operationally in July 1943, during Bomber Command's assault on Hamburg, codenamed Operation Gomorrah, and its effect on German radar defenses that night was close to total, leaving controllers unable to separate real bombers from the drifting chaff and losing track of the raid almost entirely. A more targeted countermeasure, a tunable jammer designed specifically against Würzburg and codenamed Carpet, followed later, further eroding Germany's ability to adapt once the window trick had inevitably been noticed. There was, too, an unintended consequence that worked in Britain's favor. Alarmed by the vulnerability the raid had exposed, German engineers began surrounding their radar installations with rings of barbed wire and additional defenses, changes that made the sites considerably easier to spot from the air in the years leading up to the Normandy landings. Closer to home, the raid's success gave a considerable boost to the standing of Britain's fledgling airborne forces, contributing directly to the decision to expand training facilities and formally establish the Parachute Regiment later that same year. It is difficult to draw a straight line from a single night on a French clifftop to the outcome of the entire air war, and no serious historian would claim the raid alone determined how the bombing campaign or D-Day itself unfolded. What can be said with more confidence is that Bruneval closed a dangerous gap in British scientific understanding at a moment when that gap was costing bomber crews their lives, and that the men who dismantled a radar under fire that night gave the boffins back home something they had never had before, the real machine, rather than a theory about it. Today, a memorial stands on the opposite clifftop above the site, overlooking the same stretch of coast the raiders fought across, a quiet marker for an operation that was, for decades afterwards, known to very few outside the small community of veterans and scientists who understood exactly what had been achieved. Return for a moment to that cold night above the cliffs, to the drone of Whitley engines and 120 men waiting to jump into the dark towards a machine none of them had ever seen with their own eyes. They did not know, most of them, precisely what they were fighting for beyond the orders they had been given, and they could not have known that the wiring and gears they were about to tear from a clifftop villa would help decide the shape of the air war for the following 3 years. What they achieved, in the space of a few violent hours, was to turn an enemy's advantage into a British asset, to take an unseen threat and drag it, quite literally, into the light. 3 men did not come home. A handful more were wounded or captured. Against that cost sits a chain of consequences that ran forward through Hamburg's burning radar screens, through barbed wire strung along 100 German coastal sites, through the formal birth of a parachute regiment that would go on to fight at Arnhem and beyond, and through the electronic confusion that helped clear a path for Allied aircraft over the beaches of Normandy 2 years later. It was a small raid, by a small number of men, against a single machine on a single clifftop. It was also, in its quiet and unglamorous way, one of the moments where Britain stopped guessing at what its enemy could do and started knowing. That is the whole of Operation Biting in the end. Not a battle that was won, but a piece of knowledge that was stolen, carried down a cliff path under fire and never given back,